Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. And this is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things that used to be known as the global war on terror and what we call the Long War. Of course, I'm joined today by my co-host, friend, and co-editor at FDD's Long War Journal, Caleb Weiss. Caleb is a senior analyst at the Bridgeway Foundation. And today we are going to discuss the coup in Niger. May seem a little bit off topic for us, but it isn't. There's a lot related to the jihadist movement. And today we are very happy to be joined by James Barnett. He's a research fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he studies conflict, terrorism, and geopolitics in Africa. James has worked extensively across the continent and beyond, particularly in West Africa, where James was previously based. James is here to guide us through the complexities of the current situation in Niger, where yet another Sahelian coup has shocked the region and much of the Western security world. The government in Niger, a longtime security partner for both France and the United States, now joins the likes of Mali, Chad, and Burkina Faso as the Sahelian states under military rule. However, as France and by association its allies were forced to leave both Mali and Burkina Faso by those states' ruling juntas, Niger has become the linchpin of the West security strategy in the Sahel. Niger currently hosts two major U.S. air bases that are used to support counterterrorism operations in the region. And now this is all in flux due to the rapidly changing environment. James, again, it's a pleasure to have you on. Welcome to Generation Jihad.
Thanks so much, Bill. Thanks, Caleb.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think we should just jump right into this. I think, just for the listeners who, they're definitely more than aware of the jihadist environment and, the surging and jihadist violence in the Sahel, but probably not too familiar with the internal politics of the region. So, James, if we could start with, how did we get here in the first place?
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. So I think if you kind of, a lot of this goes back to around 2020, I'd say, when Mali experienced its first coup. The civilian president of that country was deposed by his own military officers, which was followed then by a second coup in Mali in 2021, and then two coups in Burkina Faso in 2022. And so kind of the period of 2020 until kind of really the start of this year in the Sahel had seen two of the countries that had previously been a big both an epicenter of this kind of jihadist terrorism problem that you guys obviously have been tracking very closely, but also in the case of Mali, especially, it had been the epicenter of a very international response. You had, a United Nations mission in the form of MINUSMA, but you also had, a successive European counterterrorism efforts in the country, dating to the French Operation Serval in 2013. And so many of these kind of counterterrorism missions in the region, France was really kind of the driving force. The U.S. was playing more of kind of a behind-the-scenes role with ISR and air support or logistic, airlift and stuff. But the French were very much kind of the public face of these counterterrorism efforts in the region. And of course, these are Francophone West African countries. These are former French colonies. The French have a long kind of history of what's dubbed France-Afrique, meaning this kind of neo-colonial approach to the region that's often been very kind of controversial, of the French backing certain strongmen, kind of intervening in their former colonies and stuff. And I bring all that up not to say that the situation we're in is entirely the fault of the French or anything like that. I think as you guys have tracked at Long War Journal, the Operation Barkhane and the French counterterrorism efforts were a factor, kind of a check on the jihadist expansion, if not a full one, that they were kind of, serving some sort of purpose. But I bring this up because it's very important to kind of connect between the kind of international and the national or the regional dimensions. And I think that there is an interplay here. These are, these states in the Sahel are ones that have been pretty weak and have pretty weak legitimacy. This includes kind of under the former civilian regimes in these countries, the civilian administrations, and also, I would argue, presently under the military juntas in these different countries. And so these were countries that were kind of getting flooded with a lot of kind of security assistance. They're very brittle states that were being asked to do quite a lot in terms of the kind of shouldering a counterterrorism approach. In the case of Niger, that country also became the locus of counter migration efforts from the Europeans, and so there was kind of, I think, a growing sense that there were growing frustrations both within the militaries in these countries and to some extent within the public. Though I think we do need to distinguish between what happened in Mali and Burkina and what's happening in Niger, where the junta in Niger does not seem at this point to have quite as much popular support as in the other two countries, although that could change. And so essentially, you have this kind of vicious cycle at play where starting in Mali and then in Burkina, there's also the coup in Guinea that we can talk about and the kind of pseudo coup in Chad. But I think Mali and Burkina are maybe the most illustrative of these purposes. You have kind of military officers in a society that's becoming, that's always been militarized. These are societies that have had histories of coups in the past. But now it's, these are countries that are being heavily militarized with kind of Western support and stuff. These officers get this frustration. They feel that the civilian elites are benefiting more from this kind of militarization of society and the economy than the people actually fighting the wars. They have a sense that maybe they can manage things better. They have personal resentments in each of these cases, and I think very much in the case of Niger against the democratically elected presidents. And so you have these Sahelian officers kind of thinking that they're going to be able to perform better and to benefit more from the kind of the political economy of violence, the security situation, the insecurity in some ways. They think that they will benefit more from that, and they will, at least they claim, be able to handle it better than the civilian officials if they overthrow them. Now, what we saw in Mali and Burkina, of course, was that, this is very much not the case, that jihadist violence escalated. It was already trending in that way in both countries. I think it is important to recognize that. But certainly the regimes, the juntas that came to power in Mali and Burkina have employed approaches that have been, highly counterproductive and kind of exacerbating the intercommunal conflicts and tensions that really drive a lot of communities into the arms of jihadists. Niger is interesting and troubling insofar as Niger had really become kind of the locus of the kind of Western counterterrorism approach in the region, especially following the decision by the Malian junta to kick out, to kick out the French forces. They also said that MINUSMA, the UN mission, should draw down. The Burkinabe junta also said the French are no longer welcome to conduct operations. And so at the same time that those countries were expelling Western forces and also turning to some extent to the Russians, more so in the case of Mali than Burkina, which has kind of tried to play both sides. And we can talk a bit about Russia and Wagner later. But at the same time they were doing that, Niger had a genuinely democratically elected president. Certainly not without his flaws and not without some very prominent critics. He did made some controversial decisions, that kind of about stifling civil society, but he had been a democratically elected president, and he was very much, fully aligning with the US, with France, with Germany, the Europeans, saying, Niger, you guys can no longer operate in Mali and Burkina. That's a lost cause. But there are several things that are different about Niger that make us kind of a good spot for your regional counterterrorism efforts, that make us an indisputable partner. One of those regions is that a lot of the jihadist violence in Niger is not as homegrown. To some extent, it is more spillover than maybe in Mali, where you have the real kind of, and I think what we're seeing in Burkina with there's very much a homegrown element after the Ansar al-Islam, in the mid 2010s. But also a lot of it came down to strategy. And Bazoum, to his credit, was one of the problems that you have both in counterterrorism in this part of the world, but also just counterinsurgency in general and general security practices, even kind of policing, is that it tends to be, very kind of indiscriminate, heavy-handed, militarized, kind of, beating wide with a big stick. You see this even in kind of the way that, police officers in Lagos, where I've been, living the past few years, Nigeria, how they, will punish people for, they'll beat people just for basic kind of traffic infractions. There's a whole colonial history here we could go into. But, it's generally it's the easy approach for military regimes that kind of lack much credibility, that lack lots of resources. Military regimes, as I've argued, this was actually a big focus of my master's research in West Africa. Military regimes, the problem is that they become very interested in the political side of being a regime, and so they lose focus on the battlefield, and so they kind of reach for this heavy stick because it's the first tool available for them. So this is what Mali and Burkina had been doing, and of course, it was very counterproductive. Niger had been using and applying a more kind of calibrated approach, involving some DDR, involving some dialogue with some of the communities that were, affected by jihadist violence. Of course, they were still, also conducting, they were conducting military operations. You had a National Guard being set up to kind of as a paramilitary force to support these counterinsurgency efforts. But so that's, that I think is one of the reasons why a lot of Western analysts are very concerned about what's happening in Niger now, as opposed to say what happened earlier in Burkina Faso, which, no one welcomed, but it was easier to write that off. I think the question is, and obviously the other big, elephant in the room here is that there are two, as part of this security assistance and stuff, and these close relations between the West and Niger, there are 2 U.S. military bases in the country, right, totaling about 1,000 or 1,100 troops. So that's kind of the general overview, and happy to go more into detail on any one element.
Yeah, that was fantastic, man. I think you hit all the main points for setting the scene of how we got here. So I think, what's best is we move to what's currently happening. And, starting there, if we could talk a little bit about who are the major players right now in Niger, who actually did the coup, what are they calling themselves, what are they saying? And just, to tee that off, I know that the new junta in Niger is, also using the line that Mali and Burkina Faso did of that we're doing this for security. But what's interesting is, as you kind of alluded to, is that jihadist violence in Niger was kind of on, the downturn over the last couple of years. So it's totally not the same as Mali and Burkina Faso, but yet we're still using that line. So if you can explain, sort of why they're saying that, what else are they saying, and who they are, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. I mean, to speak in broad strokes, and my caveat here is that I think that there's a tremendous amount of kind of rumor swirling around, and I've not spent as much time in kind of the Nigerian information space as kind of Nigeria, which has been my main focus. So I'll try to be conservative in saying kind of what we do and what we don't know. The initial reports after kind of in the aftermath of the coup suggested that, and kind of even on the day of, this looked more like a mutiny turned coup at the time. I think in contrast to what we'd seen earlier in Mali and Burkina Faso, it had been rumored for a while that President Bazoum was looking to kind of downgrade the influence of his own presidential guard and even possibly remove the commander of that, a man named General Tiani. And so the presidential guard is one of the kind of traditionally the most prestigious units in Niger's in kind of the Nigerian security sector. They'd been involved in some putches and unprofessional behavior in the past, so they were kind of truly a Praetorian force. But the Nigerian security sector has expanded a lot since say 2011. There's this the number that actually a lot of Nigerians who are kind of supportive of this possible Nigerian intervention into Niger, which again I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later. But people are throwing around, the Nigerians just have 11,000 soldiers, and actually the more accurate and recent estimates that I've heard is it's upwards of 40,000, right? So the country's military and security sector has expanded a lot. This is again a relatively small country population wise. So the presidential guard was kind of feeling some of the pressure. There were other actors rising within the security sector, which itself had always been very fragmented historically. And so the President Bazoum effectively didn't really trust these guys. And a lot of the prestige was going to some of these counterterrorism units trained by the US or trained by the French, these special operations forces that were much more on the front lines, doing the actual, at the forefront of combating the terrorist threat. So kind of the irony of that is the elite units were the ones out in the field actually doing the fighting. It means that the units in Niamey, aka the Presidential Guard, are the ones that have the political aspirations and also have the ability to pull off a coup. So the question, and kind of on the first day, it was this question of, is this just a mutiny, or are they really trying to, overthrow Bazoum? Right? They surrounded his office, they locked him in there. Are they just coming in with some demands, or are they actually deposing him? By the end of the first day, it seemed, and I would say also that was kind of right. The best time to try to reverse a coup was when we don't even know if it's a coup. Right? Those early hours are crucial, and the real question there was going to be, will the presidential guard have the support of other elements of the security sector, other elements of the military, or are they going to side with Bazoum? And the reports we're getting was that it was kind of a bit of both. Some units were signaling support for Bazoum, others weren't. But by the end of the evening, they had kind of it had become clear that the presidential guard had achieved enough consensus within other elements of the military to form this junta, right? So they have this junta with this very kind of unimaginative name, the National Salvation Patriotic Front, CNSP. It's actually the same acronym as the junta in Burkina Faso. So these guys are not the most maybe intellectually or ideologically engaged, right? And that might in fact support the theory that this was more of kind of an unplanned mutiny, or it was planned as a mutiny and then transformed into a coup. The question, though, there are now reports saying that, well, there actually some of the presidential guard were in touch with the junta in Mali before the coup happened. What we've seen in the past few days is that Mali and Burkina Faso have lent a strong rhetorical support for the putschists. They've even pledged, kind of indirectly or implied, that they would come to Niger's defense if there was a intervention by the regional body ECOWAS, though we could discuss what if anything that might actually look like. But so it is clear that there's kind of, at least politically, in terms of the political orientation, there is kind of an anti-ECOWAS pro-coup bloc emerging with these three juntas. I'm not I haven't really had the time to look into this, and I wouldn't be the best person to kind of judge to what extent there might have been some kind of pre-planning of this. But I think, to get back to that original point, because maybe this leads us into the next question of what happens from here. The best time to reverse the coup is when you don't know if it's a coup yet, and I think that the rhetoric from ECOWAS, from the U.S. right now, for political reasons, diplomatic reasons, for a variety of reasons, some of which I think are valid, are not yet calling this a coup. But this, we're now at day what? It's been 1 week, 8 days, I think. I'm losing track of time. But each day this goes on, it becomes a more complex issue, and unfortunately, the options now aren't ideal.
Right. I mean, let's talk a little bit about that. Like, what exactly is ECOWAS saying? What is the U.S. saying? What is the French saying? And sort of, what are they doing to try to mitigate this?
Yeah, thanks. So, starting, I guess we can say, in the first days after the coup, I think a lot of observers were expecting a very feeble response, a very weak response, because that is what the U.S., the French, the ECOWAS had kind of how they had reacted to previous coups in Mali and Burkina Faso, also in Guinea. There's the whole point in Chad, which was not quite a coup, but it was a transition from one military regime to another. And for strategic interests, the U.S. and particularly the French were not exactly condemning that forcefully. The French were, really quite cozy with Chad. So I think that a lot of the expectation was that you'd have a bit of rhetoric, and then, this whole thing would fizzle out. Because also the U.S. has these very strong, compared to the other neighboring countries, the U.S. has pretty strong security interests in Niger. We have these two military bases. Immediately this debate started in Washington, and it's still ongoing now within the government and elsewhere, about whether the State Department should officially label this as a coup. There are kind of two reasons, I think, that they have held out so far. And so if you read Secretary Blinken's statements, he's still referring to the ongoing detention of President Bazoum and the need to restore constitutional order. Although his statement last night was actually a bit more vague than the previous ones, which maybe indicates that they're coming to grips with the reality of the situation, about whether Bazoum can really be reinstated. but anyway, the reason that the U.S. has kind of avoided that use of the term coup is I think twofold. First is it's diplomatic and it's political about the question of the junta itself and the official position from the U.S. and also from ECOWAS. And there is some alignment here is that it's not too late for the putschists to back down. That our demands are still that President Bazoum that he resume his duties even. So we're not recognizing that this coup has even succeeded. We just see that it's like in process because we see that there's opposition to it within Niger. We see that there's opposition to it within the region. So, this is your chance to back down. You haven't actually succeeded yet. Right. So they're kind of partially, I think it's to try to send that message, that signal to the junta. Whether or not they believe that is another matter. The other question is this the section 7008, which would require this U.S. law that would require the United States to end direct security assistance to the Nigerian military if they're involved in a coup. Now there is a waiver that they could potentially invoke that might be very politically controversial. So the sense I get now is that maybe different parts of the U.S. government are having different debates about what the approach would be. But that also hangs over the question of, is this a coup or not? Now, does the U.S. actually have a larger strategy here? That I think it's not so clear at the moment. I've talked to a couple people in government and gotten somewhat conflicting answers. One thing that has become clear, though, is that there was some surprise and even some concern about the reaction of ECOWAS, the regional body. So to go back, as I said earlier, in the past, ECOWAS has been very tepid in their response to these coups. And in the first few days after the coup we were getting the same impression, right? Tinubu, Nigerian President Bola Tinubu, newly inaugurated Nigerian president, and also now just in his third week as the rotating chairman of ECOWAS, he was very quick to condemn the coup, but a condemnation is easy, right? We were waiting to see, okay, is there going to be the usual raft of sanctions? What might those look like? Will they be a bit harsher? Some people, on social media and stuff were calling for, the Gambia option, which is a reference to 2017 when ECOWAS authorized a kind of multinational force, but largely a Nigerian force, to march into the Gambia to, depose the former president dictator who was overstaying his term in office and to hand over power to the guy who had just won the elections. And it was a success. Hardly a shot was fired. So initially, it didn't seem like that option might be on the table. And then kind of things started to shift Saturday night, Sunday morning. And all of a sudden at this, that's West African time, went at this emergency summit that ECOWAS held in Abuja, the Nigerian capital, on July 30th. That was last Sunday. ECOWAS issued an ultimatum. They said the junta has 7 days to restore constitutional order, to restore President Bazoum to office, or in addition to the sanctions that we're imposing now on day one, pretty harsh economic sanctions, the junta will consider all options, including military force. And then ECOWAS will consider all options, including military force. And to that effect, the defense chiefs of the different West African nations have met to kind of discuss in broad terms the situation in Niger. So this has raised the prospect of an armed intervention into Niger. And the concern is that Niger is not Gambia. It's bigger, it's stronger, it has a larger military. There's obviously the jihadist problem, right? You didn't have like two active jihadist insurgencies in the Gambia. And there's a question now of how much popular support the junta might have. But I think it's safe to assume that whatever support they have now, they would likely be able to increase it at least somewhat in the event of an armed invasion. They'd have this rally around the flag effect. There's a fear that they would even, I think my concern has been that they would potentially arm civilian militias, which would lead, the ECOWAS militaries, which would principally be Nigeria, to be kind of bogged down in a counterinsurgency. And what we've seen in that part of the region is that counterinsurgencies are very ugly affairs. So now there's this prospect of armed intervention. And I think that I can't speak for the U.S. government. They've not really said anything publicly about the armed intervention. I think they don't want to undercut ECOWAS. But talking to different analysts inside and outside of government, I think that there's some concern about, would ECOWAS be able to pull off a swift and quick and effective military intervention, or is this going to turn into something really nasty? And so that's where now I think the next few days are really going to be crucial. As I, in terms of ECOWAS's own reasoning, I think that the ECOWAS member states have their own reasons for wanting to take a very hard line against this coup. I think for Tinubu, it's partially personal, partially political. He was himself kind of jump-started his career as a democracy activist in exile. So he sees himself, he's very much against military rule. He doesn't have any former military officers in his cabinet, which is a big departure from his predecessors. And he also has, I think, this kind of, he's facing a lot of political challenges. A lot of Nigerians, believe that he didn't win, that the February 2023 elections that brought him to power were not credible because of some of the vote manipulation and rigging that happened in a few areas. So I think that, he has his own kind of reasons for wanting to do this. The other coastal West African states, likewise, these are countries that have their own histories of coups. They're also facing, a number of these countries, Benin, Togo, possibly Ghana, possibly Ivory Coast, facing, and now Senegal as well, facing jihadist expansion kind of at the borders. And so there's a fear that if that jihadist expansion puts more pressure on the security sector, the security sectors in those countries might turn against their civilian heads of state, and you'd have this so-called coup contagion. So I think that ECOWAS has its kind of own strong reasons, different reasons for wanting to do this. So it's a question of kind of what, if anything, is going to get both sides, both the junta and ECOWAS, off the brink of a regional war. And I think that's where we'll need to see kind of how these back channel negotiations over the next few days play out. You asked about France. Honestly, I'm not in a great position for that. I think that historically Nigeria has not had very good relations with France, and so I've been very skeptical that the French would be kind of pushing that Nigeria would be wanting to do an intervention on France's behalf. Tinubu does have stronger relations with the French than his predecessor, but I've seen no evidence that the French are kind of a driving force behind the ECOWAS policy. I think to just assume as much without evidence is kind of gets into the same level of speculation that we see, a lot of, frankly, American and European analysts say about the Wagner Group, that anytime there's a coup in Africa, it must be the Wagner Group. So I think for now, it's important to look at.
It's all the U.S. fault because they trained the officers who did it.
Yeah, right. That's the other narrative.
Now in Niger, you're getting it's all about the uranium takes.
Exactly. Exactly. So yeah, it's I think that the internal ECOWAS dynamics are often overlooked, even if it's a combination of those internal dynamics plus some external stuff. I think we really need to appreciate why the region is kind of reacting, would have good reason to react differently to this coup than the other ones.
Right, which I think you answered pretty much the next logical questions of sort of where do we go from here, and sort of what are the other states saying. You mentioned on Twitter, and I think a few other places, this idea of coup contagion, which I think you were talking about with Benin and Togo, and sort of what the littoral states are doing, who as jihadist violence is also coming down, and their governments are also not necessarily stable, going to have to deal with that idea themselves. And Sierra Leone also said that they thwarted a coup, which may or may not be true. But to talk more about sort of what happens next. Let's say that long term this does affect the U.S. stature there. What does that do for U.S. military footprint in Niger? Are they able to really do anything against the jihadi insurgency there? Like what happens next in broad scale?
Yeah, so I think we're at a position where the hope is that this threat of military intervention will kind of lead the junta to take a step back and to take negotiations seriously. I think that that's where I hold out, to the extent that I think that there's hope to kind of defuse the situation. It's there. I think a regional war would be disastrous for everyone. I don't think the junta can put up a serious kind of defense of itself as a government. I think that they would probably collapse relatively quickly, but that this would morph into some sort of very nasty counterinsurgency or kind of civil war that I don't think anyone wants. The ECOWAS with the Nigerians kind of playing the lead here have dispatched some teams to Niamey. My understanding is that some will be here today to negotiate. And what my kind of view on this has been that the Nigerians are actually in the best position, even as they kind of threaten the heaviest stick. They're also in the best position to try to convince the junta to step down, not only because they're wagging that big stick, and military guys in Niger appreciate the threat of force more than just sanctions, but also because the Nigerians have the most credibility to speak to the kind of debilitating effects that military rule will have on a nation, but also on a military. Because that was the history of Nigeria from 1966 to 1999, was that, the Nigerian military itself really became a shell of its former self and lost its prestige and lost its, capacity to handle even basic security challenges. And so eventually you had, a Nigerian military ruler who kind of power fell in his lap when the previous military ruler unexpectedly died. And he said, look, I can hold on to this because I'm a general, but this is just going to hurt. It's going to hurt the nation, and it's going to hurt the military that I, signed up for as a young man with some ideals. And thankfully, that man, General Abdulsalami Abubakar, is the one being dispatched to Niger. So I'm, hopeful. To the extent that I'm hopeful, it's that in the next couple of days, the Nigerians and ECOWAS, a combination of the pressure and the clever dialogue, will be able to produce some sort of, the junta stepping back. I think at this point, it's very unlikely that they would reinstate President Bazoum. And I think that even if they did, that would create a whole host of challenges in and of itself, unfortunately. Bazoum was, to the extent that I can gauge this, he was relatively popular, or at least not as unpopular as the civilian governments in, say, Mali and Burkina before they fell. So he was relatively popular, but definitely had his critics, some prominent critics in the country. If he were kind of brought back to power, especially with an ECOWAS armed intervention, that would do a tremendous amount of damage to his credibility domestically. Even if he's brought back to power via negotiations kind of immediately, I think the first thing he would do is try to fire the presidential, or maybe not fire him this time, but have his tea poisoned or something, right? Because there's no way that you just go back into the same security sector that just toppled you and say, okay, kumbaya, now we're all friends. So, and the junta knows that. They know that, their back is against the wall. So I think that unfortunately what we might see is more of a kind of a negotiated compromise transition that's not going to leave anyone fully happy, but might hopefully kind of avert the chaos of a broader regional war, or a kind of a hard, a junta that makes a hard break with the West and turns to Russia and turns to counterproductive counterinsurgency practices. On the U.S. question, one of the things that distinguishes the policy debate, I think, between what's happening now in Niger and, say, what happened in Mali, Burkina, Guinea. In all of those countries, the U.S. had some forms of security assistance, but we didn't have 1,000 U.S. troops. And so AFRICOM, the Pentagon, but specifically U.S. Africa Command, has a much bigger say, I think, is going to have a much bigger say in these kind of interagency deliberations over how to respond to the coup than it has in previous ones. Because it's not just going to be a question of, do we continue, providing train and equip to Nigerian forces? It's also like, well, do we maintain these bases in Niger? Because if you're completely cutting off military assistance to Niger and the Nigerians decide to turn to, Mali and the Wagner Group and stuff, but then you're also going to have these 2 U.S. bases there, like, that's probably not going to work, right? The Nigerians will say, you guys got to leave, like the Malians said to the French. So it's, I think it's tough. A lot will kind of come down to the next few days and how successful the ECOWAS mediation is. Because if they can kind of salvage something like a transitional government or what have you, then I think that it becomes a bit easier for the U.S. government to not have to change the status quo too much. I think for the moment, like train and equip and all that stuff has already paused. U.S. forces have been returned to the bases in Agadez. They're not leaving the confines of the bases. So at the moment, there's no, robust security assistance happening. just that formally, legally, these programs haven't been cut yet because the State Department has not made that call on whether or not it's a coup. So, yeah, I mean, I think the U.S. government would like for this to be resolved amicably via negotiations in the next few days, because that would, present it with the easier options. Whereas if this turns into a regional war, then there's a debate about, what's the U.S. policy to that. I don't think the U.S. should be supporting that. I think that would be a very bad look for everyone. And there's also the question of maybe there's no regional war, but maybe the juntas, maybe they just call everyone's bluff and they kind of stay in power and they pivot, like I said, to, kind of consolidating this trifecta of, juntas in Mali, Burkina, Niger, and they're a bit closer with Russia and Wagner and China. And then that, that doesn't leave many good options for the US. So, these next few days will really be critical. I'm sure that sounds a bit banal by this point, but it is.
I mean,
we're witnessing history.
Probably the best answer you can give.
Yeah.
And I think, we don't have to spend too much time on this. I just think that, with how much of a buzzword Wagner is, especially in DC, we should probably spend a little bit of time on that, especially discussing, in Mali and Burkina Faso, when those coups happened, there was already pro-Russian rhetoric. Especially in the subsequent civilian protests that happened, there was sizable pro-Russian influence within those. At least people waving Russian flags, people chanting about Russia. It hasn't really seen that here in Niger. It doesn't seem to be the similar case, but yet people are still bringing up Wagner. I know Bill and I have been pretty skeptical about Wagner's overall reach in the Sahel. But what is your take on this? Do they even have an entryway here? Is this even something that they could even do? Or what is your take on Wagner in the Nigerian context?
No, it's obviously it's a topic that's kind of generating a lot of conversation without there being much kind of substance, much hard evidence one way or the other. I think definitely. There is a certain type of kind of, quote unquote analysis or just kind of rhetoric commentary that's very popular in DC and Europe these days because of the war in Ukraine and everything, of course, that, looks to whatever's happening in Africa as a possible, either orchestrated by Wagner or, the next, guaranteed to be the next Wagner success story. I think, the Nigerians are clever about this. They know, that if you wave some Russian flags at the anti-French pro-coup demonstration, that it'll get the Americans and the French on their feet a bit, get them on their toes. So I think that they're definitely playing up the kind of possibility of, inviting Wagner in, of pivoting towards to Russia. Interestingly, the Russian Foreign Ministry, their initial response was to call this a coup. But again, if this turns into an international regional conflict, that could definitely change. So I think that it's in the junta's interest to kind of play the Wagner card, if you will. They also would potentially have an interest in really inviting these guys in to serve as auxiliaries, either kind of doing what Mali's done. If they decide to kind of abandon Bazoum's more calibrated counterinsurgency approach, then they could go the Mali Burkina route by, inviting in Wagner and being like, hey, help us commit a bunch of massacres against communities suspected of harboring terrorists, because we all know that goes so well. My hope would be that the Nigerian officers, the junta leaders, for whatever grievances they had about Bazoum and his policies and stuff, that they would kind of look at what happened in Mali and Burkina and compare that to what's been happening in Niger, and maybe say, okay, we don't need Wagner just on the counterinsurgency or on the counterterrorism stuff, right? That we don't maybe actually want them to be our principal kind of counterterrorism partner. But they might feel that they don't have many options if, one of two things happens. The first is the possibility of a serious ECOWAS invasion, which, the challenge there is that the Nigerians themselves, right? The junta is very vulnerable. I think that this really is a situation where like the war could go badly for everyone, except for, the jihadists. But the junta in Niger would be in need of external support if they really got, a decent sized intervention from Nigeria, plus some forces from, a couple other countries. So Mali and Burkina have pledged support for the junta in Niger. The Malian and Burkinabe armies, though, they can barely operate outside of their own capitals, right? The countries are just falling to the jihadists to a large extent. So there's not that much that those militaries could offer, I think. One thing they could offer, though, is, Mali, where Wagner is already operating, the shifting of Wagner forces from Mali into Niger. So that's one possible entryway into the country. The other would be if, down the line, the US and France, they really kind of cut, if there is a really acrimonious split and there's no longer any security assistance, then that's where the Nigerians might feel like, okay, well, we're going to get something from Wagner. I think, I've been focusing in this response on the Nigerian calculus, because that's what I think I have a better sense of. The Wagner calculus, I think, is pretty clear, which is that they're eager to operate in Africa, right? They're eager to operate wherever they can. It's a question of capacity. I don't really track the Wagner group, so I'm not in a great place to say. I have some colleagues at the Hudson Institute who have done some very good work on this. One of them was very, I think, accurate in his prediction of kind of how the Prigozhin mutiny was playing out. And so I think that, when I've talked to him and others, they say, well, Wagner really still has some capacity in Africa. So I think I'm inclined to trust people like him, given his pretty solid track record. But yeah, that's probably where we're standing now.
Fair enough, man. And I think this is just to check the box so no listeners complain about us not talking about jihadis. But, It is really kind of a no shit Sherlock situation of like, yeah, they're going to, really benefit from a coup. So I don't necessarily feel we need to talk about it that much. I think pretty much everyone understands the threat and implication for the jihadis if this is a successful coup, and sort of this allows for, a lessened French or, and by extension, U.S. footprint. Obviously Al Qaeda and the Islamic State are going to benefit from that. But I think we just, sort of wrap it up here. Do you have any final thoughts or any sort of final points you want to make regarding this?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly a lot of it will depend on kind of what policies the junta decides to utilize. I think that it is important not to kind of lose sense of the, I mean, I know this almost becomes a trite word talking about Africa, but like the agency of the junta, because it really is to some extent up to them. Like you could have a situation where you have a non-democratic military government that's still employing a kind of smarter counterinsurgency approach, especially when the source of the insecurity in the case of Niger is more an issue of spillover, from kind of Nigeria and the Lake Chad stuff, and then kind of from Mali and Burkina in the West. So, you could potentially have something that looks a bit closer to like what you have in Chad, which is not a good government. It's not a representative one. And I think all the structural challenges are still there, right? So like Chad could implode at any point because it has this illegitimate government. I mean, they killed like 80 protesters last year in the capital. The question of succession is going to be very fraught there. You have a history of presidential palace coups there as well. But because Chad is also, most of the jihadist violence it's experiencing is spillover, less than Niger. But they have also taken, to some extent, I think, a more calibrated approach. Whereas the fear, though, is that the junta will, for possibly a combination of kind of its own internal political reasons, as well as its the status of kind of its relationship with the West and Russia. These are going to feed off on each other, right? They're not happening in isolation. The U.S. policy might influence the internal dynamics of the junta. The internal dynamics of the junta will absolutely, influence what decisions they make about where they're looking. So I think that the fear is that if they go the route of Mali and Burkina, and which has essentially been a route of like ethnic warfare, if we're being honest, right, with the government largely playing sides by just arming these militias and committing these horrific massacres, that's where I think that's the absolute shoot yourself in the foot approach, and that's what the Nigerians are very afraid of. Benin as well, because those two countries, I think northwestern Nigeria and northern Benin, which are already very fragile areas. And the case of northern Benin is already experiencing a good bit of jihadist spillover. I think those two areas are the ones that Niger's destabilization, whatever the source, whether it's from a regional war or just a junta taking a really stupid approach to counterinsurgency, those regions are going to suffer the most. And that for me is, personally quite concerning.
All right, here we are, listeners. Generation Jihad ending on yet another negative note.
Seems to be a trend with you guys.
James, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for providing a lot of light on an issue that is very dark for many of us, Caleb and I included. We hesitate delving into the internal politics of Niger and the region because these are issues that an expert like you has to walk us through. We hope to get you back on soon and talk more.
Yeah, thanks both. Thanks for the invitation.
All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one, but only if we earned it. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again soon.